Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Please know that today's event is being recorded and it is to be uploaded on the website of the New Mandala. I'm Mary Joyce Bulao, a PhD student of Political and Social Change here at the ANU's Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs. I'm on leave from my faculty position at the Ateneo de Naga University in the Philippines. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the Nunawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region, and to all First Nations Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and work, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Thank you for joining us today for the second of 3 forums on the upcoming presidential transition in the Philippines. The first one was held on April 21, when the May 9 presidential elections was analyzed prospectively. Today, we will examine the transition from the Duterte administration to the incoming presidency of Marcos Jr., and listen to some retrospective analysis of the outgoing administration. And on the 11th of August, we will close out the series with a prospective examination of the new administration. We at the ANU gratefully acknowledge the support provided for this initiative by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. To give you an overview of how the rest of our forum is organized, I will begin with some brief framing comments, and we will then proceed to our 4 very distinguished analysts joining us from Europe, Manila, and here at the ACT. Cleve and Ross will each give us roughly 15 minutes of analysis, and Bjorn and Christina will have 15 minutes as well. We shall then proceed to the Q&A. The bias of our speakers came with an invitation to the talk, but allow me to introduce them briefly still. Our first speaker is Cleve Orgelius, who is a political scientist doing research on populism in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. He's a PhD candidate in the Department of Political and Social Change at the ANU Bell School and assistant professorial lecturer in the Department of Political Science and Development Studies at De La Salle University. His research on democracy, disinformation, and youth have been published in Asian Politics and Policy, Democratic Theory, Review of Women's Studies, and Southeast Asian Affairs. Our second speaker is Bjorn Dressel, who is an associate professor at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy. His research is concerned with issues on comparative constitutionalism, judicial politics, and governance and public sector reform in Asia. He has published in a range of international journals, including Governance, Administration, and Society, International Political Science Review, and Pacific Review. He is the editor of The Judicialization of Politics in Asia and co-editor of Politics and Constitutions in Southeast Asia, and From Aquino II to Duterte, Continuity, Change, and Rupture. Our third speaker is Christina Bunoan, who is a lawyer and a senior lecturer at the University of the Philippines College of Law. Specializing in governance and human rights, her research is concerned with issues of judicial politics, rule of law, and access to justice. Our fourth and final speaker is Ross Tapsal, who is a senior lecturer and researcher at ANU specializing in Southeast Asian media, digital cultures, and disinformation. His recent publications include Divide and Rule, Populist Crackdowns, and Media Elites in the Philippines, and Demystifying Disinformation Shadow Economies, Fake News Work Models in Indonesia and the Philippines, co-authored by John Ong. All right. So at this point, allow me to share some brief framing comments, mainly to give you an overview of the Duterte administration, parts of which will be covered more extensively by our speakers. I'll also share some notes in the Marcos cabinet to hopefully pique your interest, so you'll join our August forum. Okay, so here's the outline for my framing comments. I will talk about what are the major trends under the Duterte administration and how we might characterize Duterte-Marcos relations. I will also present the results of the 2022 presidential elections and share with you the key cabinet positions under the upcoming Marcos administration. Duterte has been able to maintain relatively high satisfaction, approval, and trust ratings throughout his term. As you can see from this figure, from the social weather station issued in January this year, Rodrigo Duterte's satisfaction rating has mostly remained at the honeymoon levels since he assumed office in 2016. Compared to previous post-Marcos presidents, Duterte has registered the highest net satisfaction rating of 75%, which was in November 2020. It was also the highest, he also has the highest satisfaction rating at the end of term when compared to all post-Marcos presidents. In fact, in the latest survey conducted by Publicus Asia, another reputable polling firm in the Philippines, his approval rating is at 67.2%, while his trust rating is at 61.2%. With such consistent high ratings, the main question we would have naturally would be, how has he been able to maintain such popularity? For one, Rodrigo Duterte has instituted key social reforms, including the universal health care, which was approved February 2019, the conditional cash transfer, April 2019, and the free tertiary education on May 2017.
Oh, come on.
Aside from the extensive benefits, especially to the masses of these social reforms, Duterte's distinctive brand of politics has consistently put him in the limelight and somehow polarized the population. First on the list is the war on drugs, which on the latest count had more than 6,000 deaths in the official counts, but is estimated to have reached 27,000 to even 30,000 in reality. At one point, he even jokingly said that he dumped bodies of drug lords in the Manila Bay. Second is the extensive use of social media, which gave birth to what is now known as troll armies, who are ready to defend Duterte on social media on whatever issues that are thrown his way. There's also his quote-unquote independent foreign policy. Duterte did not act upon the ICC ruling on the West Philippine Sea issue, which was won by the Philippines in 2016. We will hear more about Duterte and the media from Ross, and Duterte and human rights and the law from Christina and Bjorn. While the Duterte brand of politics has led to issues themselves, there are still other big issues during his term. These include the killing of a 17-year-old student, Kian de los Santos, which subsequently led to public outrage. We have the issue on the supposed early release of rape and murder convict former Mayor Antonio Sanchez, and the controversial Good Conduct Time Allowance, or the GCTA law, and the removal of Justice Sereno as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Then just recently, we have the government's alleged overpriced 42 billion COVID-19 supply contracts with Pharmally, a newly established company without track record in terms of handling government contracts. The issue broke during the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee's investigation of unused pandemic response funds. Pharmally executives afforded themselves luxury cars, one of which is seen in the picture, a blue Lamborghini. At some point, an executive during the investigation explained that she woke up with a Lexus in her garage. Michael Yang, Duterte's former economic advisor, and Lloyd Christopher Lau, former Department of Budget and Management Procurement Service head, have been linked to the corruption scandal. In the Senate report following the proceedings, there was no recommendation to charge President Duterte. However, it detailed the chief executive's accountability, quote unquote, for what has transpired in this great anomaly. The thing about the Duterte administration is that despite it being riddled with so many issues and controversies, they never seem to stick, like Teflon, Paul jokingly said at some point. This timeline of issues vis-a-vis satisfaction ratings show that Duterte's popularity seemed to have withstood all of these scandals. At this point, let me briefly share with you the election results with the slides I borrowed from June Espia of Canterbury University. Marcos won with a very large margin, getting 58.8% of the votes and taking 64 out of 81 provinces. For the vice presidency, Sara Duterte also got a landslide win with an even higher percentage of vote at 61.5%. With Marcos Jr. assuming office in a week's time, let us try and look into his cabinet so far. we can see here, that the economic team chosen by Marcos have somehow have what do you call that, credibility and track record. And the rest, here are the other notable appointments, and we can say that these are seemingly more political by nature. Okay, now sorry for that. With Marcos, let's take a look at the relationship between the outgoing president and Marcos Jr. to try to understand how the transition could be. Certain events can offer hints as to how we can characterize the relationship. When Sarah announced that she will run for VP under Marcos Jr., Duterte made a controversial comment that a presidential candidate who is a rich only son is a cocaine user. In his displeasure of her daughter's decision, he even briefly filed his candidacy for the Senate. Last Sunday, June 19th, on Sarah Duterte's inauguration as VP, you can see the picture here. Pictures show seemingly awkward moments. But of course, while a picture can tell us 1,000 words, we can only speculate as to the relations between and among these people. So that's it. Thank you very much. At this point, we give the floor to Cleve Arguelles. His presentation will be followed by Ross Tapsel and then by Bjorn, and finally, the presentation of Bjorn and Christina will be last. Cleve?
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you for your framing comments and for opening this webinar. Thank you again for having me as part of this panel. I'm happy to join this conversation and share my thoughts. I've actually written my reflection so far on the results of the elections, and also looking back, of course, on what the Duterte administration, what role did the Duterte administration play in that particular result. And I'll be discussing that piece right now. I've written it the day after the election, but I'm continuously updating it. So I also look forward to your feedback later on. So the title of my presentation is The Marcos Duterte Leviathan. The 2022 Marcos Duterte landslide electoral victory represents the triumph of the old order in the Philippines. What was in crisis and decay, supposedly, can be made attractive and fresh again, as shown how voters embrace it fully in this election. The anti-people power project succeeded on the ballots. Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte are the first majority-elected president and vice president since 1965. The vice president-elect also now holds the record for getting the most votes for any office in a single winner election in the entire electoral history of the country. For the first time too, since 2004, a president and vice president were elected together as a tandem. Although surprising, we know that we did not get here yesterday. It took the old order restorationists more than 3 decades of learning from mistakes, massive resources, and political discipline to pull it off. The 2022 elections, despite the pretense of change messaging, is by all means a continuity election. President Rodrigo Duterte, while he eroded democracy and human rights in the country and left Filipinos on their own during the pandemic, is ending his term as among the most popular of the Fifth Republic or the 1987 Constitution presidents. He has killed thousands in the drug war, jailed and harassed opposition politicians, shut down the country's biggest broadcast station, and pursued friendship with China. Despite this, most Filipino voters have a very positive assessment of his administration and continues to support him. PRRD's popularity can actually be seen to have driven the demand for a presidential candidate who can do a Dutertismo 2.0. In our own survey at WR Numero, around 54% of the voters prefer partial continuity or partial change, while 30% of them say they want full continuity. You see this in the pie graph on your right. Only 16% of the surveyed are looking for a president who will represent a total change from the Dutertismo. So definitely what we see here is that the continuity camp, the continuity constituency is bigger than the change constituency. The Marcos Duterte tandem have clearly positioned themselves as the continuity candidates, and in fact, perceived by voters as such. It did help, of course, that the Vice President-elect Sara Duterte is very known publicly as the president's daughter. Unlike past elections, who won the 2022 elections were also decided not on election day. Most of the voters already made up their minds even before the start of the campaign period. It was a done deal then. Less voters were even willing to go through the long rituals of the election season. Majority of the respondents in this another survey at WR Numero already had the presidential choice at the start of the campaign period. And President Duterte did not give his explicit endorsement to the candidacies of Marcos and Duterte because his role was already done even before the curtains were raised. Since 2016, he has mobilized state resources to repudiate the memories of people power and rehabilitate the image of the Marcos family. In my previous writings, I have documented how he used government resources in support of a public amnesia. He has repeatedly talked about the rule of Ferdinand Marcos and the supposed lasting achievements of the dictatorship. He also ordered the burial of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. after decades in interregnum in the Libingan ng mga Bayani, or the National Cemetery of Heroes. And most importantly, he has also flirted and legitimized martial law and authoritarian politics, popularly associated with Marcos Sr. In short, I think he has resurrected and infused fresh insurgent populist energies to what was then the dying family brand of the Marcos. And this will be one of what will be his enduring insidious legacies in Philippine politics. This wasn't, of course, all of Duterte's doing. The Marcos family also reaped the benefits of investing in a massive online disinformation machinery that have been put into operations as early as 6 years ago. The on-the-ground disinformation campaigns have been in place for far longer. Pro-Marcos disinformation campaigns have dominated social media platforms popular to a cross-section of Filipino voters, including Facebook and YouTube. The disinformation campaigns have been effective. For instance, WR Numero commissioned interviews with more than 500 plus Marcos Duterte voters around the country, revealed that many of their voting considerations were significantly shaped by the disinformative narratives that were made popular online. Many of their voters think that the Philippine martial law years was the country's golden era, that the Marcos legacy is that of public infrastructures that people enjoy today, and that the plunder of state resources the conjugal dictatorship and their cronies committed were nothing but black propaganda from the yellow armies. The Marcos disinformation machinery has also systematically targeted young voters in social media platforms like TikTok. These TikTok disinformation campaigns were designed to portray the Marcos family as authentic, as hip, and relatable political celebrities, while downplaying the family's leadership of some of the country's worst cases of corruption and human rights abuses. For instance, a young voter I have talked to showed me old videos of Imelda Marcos she has quote-unquote rediscovered in TikTok. In these videos, Imelda was justifying the use of government resources for her personal excesses, shoes, clothes, painting, by discussing her supposedly uniquely Filipino philosophy of beauty. But all these efforts on the part of Duterte and the investments on disinformation could have been for nothing if not for the intervention of the political elder of the coalition. This coalition has been also called Axis of Evil or the Mad Alliance, Marcos Arroyo Duterte Alliance. The Marcos Duterte dynastic tandem represents a perfect political marriage of some of the most entrenched, formidable, and notorious political bosses and families, not to mention almost all the politically active first families. Arroyo, Duterte, Estrada, Marcos, also Romualdez Villar. While the marriage was inconvenient at first, as proven by PRRD's last-minute desperate charades and tantrums against Marcos Jr., the commanding wisdom of former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo prevailed. At nine years, Arroyo is the longest-serving president of the country in the 1987 era, and together they stand. Divided, they might all end up jailmates. So the political elder that she is, she had to broker the arranged marriage. The arranged marriage kept the house in order, at least for now. It promised to deliver an unmatched unity machinery, and it did during the elections. The North and South proved to be as solid as expected. Many of the coalition families have been in control of their provinces since the return of elections in the country. And among other resources, what this control of a province meant during the election season is that they were able to deploy proven grassroots election machines and through it organize cash distribution, network building, and even turnout discipline. The Marcos and Duterte families of Ilocos Norte and Davao City are, of course, best examples of this. The arranged marriage ensured a concentration of significant political resources in the Marcos Duterte campaign, especially including local political allies. Outside their command bailiwicks of the North and the South, this allowed them to corner the endorsements and investments of incumbents in market vote-rich areas of Central Luzon, South Luzon, and Metro Manila. Without the marriage, they would have competed for these resources instead. But why the marriage? Well, there is nothing like fear of enduring another 6 years or more of persecution, prosecution, and popular mobilization in another reform government that brings the coalition families, especially Arroyo, Duterte, and Marcos, together. Former President Joseph Estrada was in jail for 7 years, Arroyo in hospital arrest for 4 years. The International Criminal Court, as we all know, has an ongoing investigation, although temporarily suspended, on the role of PRRD and other high government officials in the drug war killings. It is this shared perception of threat, as Dan Slater argued, that elites may be driven to form an authoritarian leviathan that we now see in states like Malaysia and Singapore. What a potential another reform government represented to the coalition is what Carl Polanyi would characterize as, I quote, the impress of an acute danger, which will endure as long as its ultimate cause is not removed, end of quote. The Marcos Duterte Leviathan, then, is a product of collective learnings on the part of the coalition families against the persecution, prosecution, and popular mobilization they have faced under several reform governments in the past. It was built not merely to withstand the persistent challenges of the day, but to facilitate the difficult work of creating more enduring and durable defenses against all hopes of reform. There is no need for the old world to die if the people do not struggle for a new order to be born. And there are reasons to believe that the dangers and memories of popular mobilization do haunt the coalition. The Marcos, Estrada, and Arroyo families have all suffered from civil society-led movements against their governments. Although the one against Arroyo wasn't successful enough to kick her out of power, it was no less traumatizing. One can see evidence of this in how quick and violent her repressive response was against the Estrada-led EDSA Tres mobilization to undo her presidency. For Duterte, my interviews with top members of his 2016 campaign team revealed similar worries. For one, his campaign manager, June Vasco, formerly of the Communist Party of the Philippines, claims that he and Duterte have repeatedly talked about how a charismatic and popular figure like him could also suffer the fate of that of another charismatic and popular figure, Estrada. A middle-class-led reformist coalition could always decide to take to the streets. However, Evasco's suggestion to prepare for a counter-mobilization through organizing grassroots groups like the Bolivarian Circles of Hugo Chavez didn't really see the light of the day. The Kilusang Pagbabago movement was allowed to start, but it wasn't really given enough attention and resources to take off. Then it was just shelved and declared out of purpose after some time. Evasco's ideas, however, may find a more willing audience in the new Society 2.0. The coalition appears to be more prepared than ever to defend its gains. But if their supporters didn't show up during the campaign season, would they show up to counter-mobilize against another people power? The point of the Leviathan, after all, is to scare the people into submission, to demobilize them. So should the coalition even worry about a potential popular mobilization? They have mobilized a cross-class coalition with the supposedly reformist middle and upper classes, embracing them strongly as they did Duterte. It's entirely possible that in the next 6 years, aside from the usual suspects, we won't see anyone taking to the streets because they are part and behind the Leviathan. And if this is the case, then what we can see is that New Society 2.0 is in many ways also the Dutertismo 2.0. The next 6 years is shaping up to look like a nation demobilized, out of fear and in awe of the strength of the Leviathan, supporting an empowered and unrestrained dynastic tandem, Marcos and Duterte. Thank you very much for having me in this webinar, and I look forward to the comments, the presentations of my other co-panelists, and the discussions that we will have later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cleve. We now give the floor to Ross.
Thank you, and wonderful presentation, Cleve, and lovely to see you all here. Thank you to all the organizers, and thanks to everyone who's come today. Okay, so unless you've been living under a rock, and Cleve has nicely summarized the sort of main points of this argument of disinformation, but social media has really been the story of the campaign for a lot of the international media, and indeed for some of the key Filipino speakers and global scholars on this issue. Now, I won't summarize all of their arguments here. There's a lot of great work out there. There's a lot of great publications, and Cleve has done a good job of summarizing the main arguments. But let me just read a paragraph from preeminent scholar Sheila Coronel on this, which I think sums up this sort of general argument, and then I'll get into my analysis a bit further on. And Sheila writes that largely unnoticed by the mainstream media, the Marcos family had created an alternative information ecosystem that appealed to large sections of the population who felt unseen and unheard by liberal elites and the news media. A generation born with no memory of the Marcos regime and who received their information via mobile phones soon filled online spaces where Marcos revisionism reigned. The Marcos family cast themselves as victims of the democratic establishment, a narrative that resonated among average Filipinos who felt that the promise of democracy was a mirage. Like populists elsewhere, from Donald Trump to Jair Bolsonaro, Marcos Jr. used social media to engage them and spread false claims and conspiracy theories that fed their resentments. I think that sums up sort of the key points. Now, of course, the Philippines has been at the center of debates around the role of populism and social media since Duterte's election victory in 2016, before Trump was elected that same year, where a Facebook executive described the country as the patient zero of disinformation. Filipinos are some of the highest, if not the highest, as this graph suggests here on the We Are Social, some of the highest internet users some of the highest users of social media for people that use the internet. Facebook in particular, it's about close to 100% of people who have internet tend to use social media, with Facebook the highest. Facebook has indeed been described as the internet for many Filipinos, especially those who have Facebook free basics, where access outside of Facebook is discouraged due to financial reasons. Now, as we know, Bongbong Marcos has been campaigning on Facebook and other social media platforms, such as YouTube, since he was a senator and vice presidential candidate in 2016. And his campaign had started years ago, and Facebook, of course, was central. By 2022, his pages had generated the most followers online, with YouTube in particular a space for video content questioning the narrative that martial law even existed, and that the previous Marcos administration was a golden age of infrastructure development and so on. For the record, Marcos Jr. has denied he uses troll farms as well as their influence to revise history. Here's a quick wrap that I just pinched from ABS-CBN about a month ago, where they tracked the mentions of each candidate for the past 7 years. And basically their argument is that Bongbong Marcos has always been the dominant social media voice and having the most mentions on social media for a long period of time. So so the story Philippine populist wins election through highly funded Facebook and YouTube campaign has been written years ago in 2016. It is in many ways old news. So how does one jazz up an election story that we've heard 5 years ago? 7 years ago, I should say. Facebook fails again. Google and Facebook fact-checking programs redundant, maybe, could be the headline. Philippines again elects populists, proving continual misuse of power of Silicon Valley. Doesn't quite get it, does it? All sounds a little bit boring. So the media has largely been focusing on the excitement of TikTok. That's right, this election story has often been around this narrative that young Filipinos were being fooled predominantly by glossy videos on TikTok, owned by ByteDance based in China. Of course, this story of Chinese platform disinformation is a nice one, not Chinese platform, but Chinese own platform disinformation is a nice one for the Western media. But it also suggests, as many scholars and writers have done, that it is the young without the memory of the 1986 EDSA revolution who are predominantly responsible for the BBM Sara Duterte victory. Now, there are certainly many young people who are ignorant of the Marcos dictatorship and the crimes committed. And the initial survey, however, initial surveys show that age is less meaningful in correlation in voting patterns for candidates. And what's more important is regional affiliation. Now, this is early days, and I'm going here on some work done by some scholars who published in the Washington Post. But my point is that we can't necessarily attribute the election victory predominantly to youth voters on TikTok, as novel and as exciting as that story sounds. In fact, Bongbong Marcos's victory really is one of continuity rather than new and innovative campaign methods. Scholars, and I've listed some of my work and others here, and there is much more and a lot of great scholars now working on this, particularly in the Philippines. Scholars have been long researching this phenomenon of social media campaigning and online disinformation in the Philippines, in particular given this entrepreneurial digital campaign industry and low labor costs, allowing it to create what we're looking at now as a so-called disinformation industry. One that we said in 2019, Jonathan Ong and Nicole Curato and I said in 2019 that disinformation was becoming more prevalent, more strategically obscured, more influential in shaping political conversations. Scholars have been calling for more interventions from COMELEC, the PR industry, government, NGOs, but more importantly from Silicon Valley itself in order to face this growing challenge of disinformation in Southeast Asia and in particular in the Philippines, which undoubtedly spikes at election time. My recent work with John Ong tries to categorize the 4 work models of disinformation campaign production in order to better understand how to regulate it. Because quite obviously, we can't really introduce a Malaysia-style law which jails people for creating or spreading so-called fake news by defining fake news as, and I quote, news which is false or fake. So we need to understand the political economy of disinformation production and its growing space in political economy. My point here, as I conclude on disinformation, is that we might have been surprised that a 2016 Duterte populist campaign run on social media on drugs and crime catapulted him to victory before Trump, Brexit, Bolsonaro, and others. But we shouldn't be too surprised by the scale, narratives, nor effectiveness of the Bongbong Marcos social media campaign in 2022. In fact, it just further proves that we haven't found a way to solve one of the greatest challenges of our current time, which is how to stop digital media from becoming a force for powerful elite manipulation and authoritarianism. Okay, on to mainstream media. In 2017-2018, I spent time in Manila interviewing key media owners and asking them how they saw the Duterte regime. The resulting research showed the acquiescence, even complicity, in much of the Philippines' mainstream media in adhering to Duterte's semi-authoritarian style of governance and his so-called war on drugs. The Duterte government was adept at classifying media as either friends of the administration or enemies, as populists tend to do. Rappler, the Philippines Daily Inquirer, and ABS-CBN and its owners were largely seen as enemies. Prominent women in the media have been attacked publicly by Duterte and by his supporters online. Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa is most well known for this, but many others were also attacked online and by Duterte in his speeches. And you know the story here. Bongbong Marcos' decision not to show up to almost all of the mainstream media debates during the campaign showed his disdain towards media as a beacon of accountability, choosing to appear only on the station of his friend Apollo Quiboloy, and generally not granting interviews with independent media companies. Populists rail against elites, including media elites, but in fact, their modus operandi is to nurture media moguls as allies. And it's fairly clear that allies to the new vice president and president will be rewarded under this new administration. I've got some examples there. What about the enemies? Well, it's been interesting looking early at some of the reporting of organizations like Philippines Daily Inquirer and Rappler, where Philippine Daily Inquirer has had this page 7, a page in history, which they've been running every day for the last couple of weeks, which is most of the time the front page of the Philippine Daily Inquirer from around about 1986 or mid to late 1980s. And often they have a headline in there relating to Marcos. There are other times that they pick other years, but for the most part, they're looking at the mid to late 1980s. And obviously they feel like that Filipinos should be learning more of this history, and it's perhaps to counter some of the disinformation narratives online. Similarly, the other day I was looking at Rappler in the aftermath of Sara Duterte's inauguration, and while every other mainstream media chose to have Sara on the front page and being inaugurated, Rappler's website front and center was Duterte institutionalizing disinformation, paving the way for a Marcos victory, with Duterte's inauguration, Sara Duterte's inauguration further down. Now, I'm not questioning the editorial judgment here. I think it's perfectly fine for these organizations to go about that. But I guess my point is we are going to see a more polarized media landscape in the Philippines, where we will see media who see themselves as their role is to comment on critique, but also perhaps to change the narrative of history given the disinformation campaign that has been running. The challenge, of course, as this latest graph that I've got up there shows from the Reuters Journalism Institute on media trust, suggests that even a company like media company like ABS-CBN, which was largely, which was the most popular watched television show and one of the most popular in the Philippines prior to Duterte beginning to attack it and eventually shut it down, now has these low brand trust scores. So there's obviously a clear correlation between so-called lack of trust in the media, which is attacked by the administration. And this is the challenge that independent media will face and then they have been facing over the past 5 years and into the next 5 years. And of course, those who've been online recently would see that even the disinformation campaign around these trust scores has been happening this week online. So in conclusion, a couple of concluding slides. I just thought I'd put up, I've been looking at these trust scores in more detail recently, and thanks to Ronnie Holmes for sending me some details on credibility on media. And it's really interesting to look back and forward at how Filipinos rate the credibility of the media. And in fact, in 2010, they thought the media was less credible than the media is now. And indeed, that includes the internet. Generally, people, according to these surveys, find that internet in covering the campaign is more credible in 2022 than it was in 2010. And that seems extraordinary, right, on a number of levels. One, because we've just explained about all of this disinformation campaign, and you would think people would therefore lack trust, especially in internet coverage. And secondly, this doesn't reflect regional trends. Actually, when you look at most countries in Southeast Asia, trust in media, in particular trust in internet media during an election campaign, tends to decline because they see all this crazy campaign material and disinformation production, and they seem to think that things are worse. But this is not the case necessarily, according to these surveys, in these when we compare 2010 to 2022. And in fact, the surveys perhaps suggest that a sign of Philippines' democratic decline, the idea that for the most part, when you look at semi-authoritarian countries, they tend to say that the media is reasonably well trusted. And in authoritarian countries, Russia would be a good example. People tend to say that they trust the mainstream media more. They're more likely to have higher scores in trust levels than you would say in democracies. So perhaps that's the conclusion, or perhaps there's more to this if we think about the way that television is moving online, and we need to think more about trust scores. So most of what I said to this point has, unsurprisingly, been fairly negative. And while a Marcos Jr. victory was perhaps unsurprising, what ended up being surprising throughout the campaign was the mass rallies for the Leni Robredo candidacy and the way in which the Pink Revolution movement grew in the final stages of the campaign. And for me, as someone who's been working on Malaysia for 10 years, I can see some similarities, at least, in the Leni rallies and the sort of mass movement there, and the way in which social media was organized to promote messages, to the Bersih rallies in Malaysia, a picture on your bottom right there. To just quote one scholar, Lynette Ong, on this, Bersih is a movement that calls for political change not by empowering people to topple the government directly, but through strengthening practices and institutions that legitimately help people vote the government out of power. We are undoubtedly in a race between Democrats seeking to empower people through the internet and dictatorships that want to censor and restrict it. Much of what I've talked about today was about the role of digital technology manipulating or hindering the democratic process. But I saw enough in this online campaign in the election to believe that social media may still play a liberating role in the Philippines if the opposition can effectively coalesce around the potential blunders or even plunders of the new administration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ross, for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure a lot of you have your questions ready. You can use the chat box later when we open it for the question and answer. Bjorn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joyce, and thanks, Ross, for a fascinating presentation. Welcome, everyone. Christina and I, we are going to talk about the rule of law and the Supreme Court in particular. So we have entitled our short presentation here, Reflections on the Supreme Court and the Rule of Law. In many ways, there is a lot of work that has been done in the last couple of years on rule of law developments in the Philippines. But one of our arguments that we would like to put forward today is that there has been far less work on the Supreme Court of the Philippines, a critical institution, a critical veto player. And in some ways, the rule of law and the Supreme Court are, of course, important actors when it comes to constraining executive abuse and some of the tendencies that Cleve and even Ross just mentioned. So what we thought we do today is go in 3 steps. I will hand over to Christina in a minute to look back at the Duterte administration and briefly reflect on some of the developments in the rule of law and the rule of law space and in regards to the Supreme Court. Then I would like to take a little bit of time and present some recent findings of our study on the Supreme Court and in particular decision-making under the Duterte administration. That's a bit numbers driven, but it just gives you an indication of some of the dynamics that have unfolded under the Duterte administration. And then finally, we will look forward and we will speculate a little bit, and I hand over back to Christina about what might be happening in the next couple of years in the rule of law space, and in particular in regards to the Supreme Court of the Philippines. So without further ado, let me hand over to Christina, and then I will jump back in a minute.
Thank you, Bjorn. As already mentioned, the rule of law in the Philippines has experienced significant setbacks under Duterte. This includes, of course, the much covered war on drugs, and as well as extensive reports and coverage on extrajudicial killings and the red tagging of activists and human rights advocates. Meanwhile, less discussed is how Duterte has managed to weaponize legal systems, and including attacking his political foes, and a systematic assault on oversight agencies, which includes not just the courts, but the ombudsman, the constitutional and the constitutional commissions, which these have all contributed to constitutional backsliding. And Bjorn and I are particularly concerned with these issues because of their longer term effects on Philippine politics, as well as accountability institutions, especially the courts. And speaking of the Supreme Court, compared to the rest of the region, the Philippine Supreme Court has generally been considered an activist court, unafraid to tackle political questions and usually having high rates of dissent among the justices. However, scandals and concerns have plagued the Supreme Court under Duterte, which include, as already mentioned, the ouster of Chief Justice Sereno, allegations of court stacking, with Duterte now having appointed all but 2 of the members of the Supreme Court. And finally, there are concerns in the patterns of votes of the Supreme Court in highly political cases that appear to almost always favor the Duterte administration. And Bjorn will now discuss these concerns in relation to our findings in a recent study of the court and presidential loyalties.
Thank you, Christina. So what I would like to do now is to present a few statistics on the court and put the court into perspective over time. So as Christina said, we currently finished a paper on the Supreme Court. It looks back at the Supreme Court from 1987 to 2020. Here I present some data, including data from 2022 about Supreme Court appointments. And I think I would like to point out 4 areas of interest. Number 1, Duterte as a president had the chance to appoint a high number of Supreme Court justices. In fact, despite only having a 6-year term, he appointed almost as many Supreme Court justices as President Arroyo. Second, it's important to note that while there is a traditional dominance of certain law schools in the Philippines, including the University of the Philippines or Ateneo de Manila, in terms of background of the Supreme Court justices, he and under his administration, we also see an unusual high degree of some beta graduates, that is the university where the president himself graduated from, appointed to the Supreme Court. That is unusual, as you can see here in our slide. It's a very high number and might speak to some of the alumni and fraternity networks that are existing in the Philippines. Likewise, and somewhat surprising for us as outside observers, is the high degree of appointees from the career judiciary. Normally, we always see appointees that come from academia or even from the private sector. That tendency has been declining over time, one has to admit that, but certainly unusual that under Duterte, most of the appointees to the Supreme Court all came from the career judiciary. And finally, when we look at the regional distribution, we can also see that somewhat unusual, the highest number, in fact, since 1987 of justices appointed to the Supreme Court have now come from Mindanao. That is to say, we never have seen such a high percentage of justices which trace their family roots back to Mindanao appointed to the Supreme Court. Having said all of this, there's little doubt that the Supreme Court bench of the Philippines is not a very diverse bench when we look at gender, when we look at regional distribution, and we certainly don't see much diversity either when it comes to the number of law schools that dominate the Supreme Court bench. We can talk about this separately, but not necessarily unusual in comparison to, say, at the Supreme Court of the United States. I present here a quick slide on the average tenure of justices on the Supreme Court bench. And what I mean to say here is that, of course, these are quite senior justices, so they come to the bench relatively late in their career. The mandatory retirement age is at 70. So an average 7 years, justices will stay on the bench. But what is kind of unusual under the Duterte administration is that Duterte decided to appoint a number of justices in the beginning of his term, so that is to say in the first 2-3 years, that were relatively short-term appointees. So in other words, they were quite old already when appointed to the Supreme Court bench. They didn't stay on very long. And that in turn allowed him to appoint a whole a number of new justices to the bench. And interestingly enough, in the second half of his term, these appointments were generally younger and they would also stay much longer. Not to mention, of course, that also during his term, he had the chance to appoint 4 chief justices, and the current chief justice is still going to stay on for at least another 5 years. Now, we then looked in detail into what we call mega-political cases. Mega-political cases are generally political cases that have a tendency to divide a nation, that test the constitutional fabric of a nation in a particular way. And so our data set, and I just should make that very clear from the beginning, were essentially a comprehensive look at all mega-political cases decided since 1987. And what you can see from our slide here is that while there is always a tendency of the court to generally vote in higher numbers for the sitting administration in these cases, the tendency to vote for the sitting administration under Duterte has been particularly high. In fact, almost 89% of cases were decided in favor of the Duterte administration. And so when you recall cases like the Marcos burial case, the martial law decision, the De Lima case, and so on and so forth, most of these cases went in favor of the administration. Having said this, and Christina hinted at this already, this is, of course, counting the court as a bench, but that doesn't mean that dissent still remains on the bench, and I will look into this in a minute together with you. In fact, one of the most interesting questions that we try to look at is, to what degree do we see factions of justices voting consistently together in these cases? And that raises a broader question of relationships, but what we can also call factional alliances on the bench. And so what we have done here is simply a simple correlation matrix in which we have listed all the justices that are involved in these cases on the left-hand side, and they're repeated here on top as well. The first set of justices are GMA appointees. The second set of justices are appointees of the Aquino administration, the previous administration. And here you see the amount of justices appointed under Duterte. And while this is probably a bit hard to read from the outside, you should just look at the coloring here. The darker the red, the more we see votes that coincide. And so what I wanted to highlight here for you is that there is a distinct Duterte bloc that has consistently voted together in some of these cases. And most interestingly, that Duterte bloc has also a tendency, at least in the initial cases, to vote with GMA appointees. By contrast, appointees under Aquino, the third, they seem to have a tendency not necessarily to vote together, nor have they a tendency to vote together with either the Duterte or the GMA bloc, at least in a consistent manner. So what that then suggests to us, and this is just something we can keep for the discussion, is that they're not only appointees of presidents that tend to vote together as a group, but there might even be tendencies or dynamics at play that suggest that when political alliances are formed at the political level, let's say between GMA and Duterte, that might also transcend onto the bench, at least in political cases. Finally, just as a qualification here, we also ran some regression analysis testing essentially for loyalty effects. And what we wanted to find out is how likely is it that appointees of a president will vote for the appointing president? And I think what I just wanted to show you here is there is generally a tendency to do so. Appointees will show some degree of loyalties when it comes to votes in these political cases. But the tendency to vote for President Duterte is much higher and statistically significant across all our model specifications, which means when we control for other variables such as prior jobs, what university they graduated from, what type of cases were decided. In fact, one could almost see from our numbers here that the likelihood to vote for Duterte is 25% higher consistently than if we compare to previous appointees from administrations of his predecessors. So on that note, let me hand back to Christina. I guess the point to take away from this empirical segment is there are a number of unusual tendencies and developments that have happened under the Duterte administration. And so the real question to ask now is, what would we expect to see in the years to come? The new presidency, keep in mind, it's quite unusual that there is only a single-term presidency. We don't see a similar dynamic elsewhere in the world. And so let me hand over to Christina to explore and in some ways speculate a little bit what might happen, what we might like to see in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Bjorn. As Bjorn mentioned, given the patterns that we found, patterns and possible factional alliances that we found under Duterte, what can we expect from the incoming administration? There are some rule of law concerns. There are concerns whether he will continue the policies of the Duterte administration, including the war on drugs. Marcos has already offered Duterte the post of drug czar, which he has recently declined. Maybe the other day he recently declined. EJ case, extrajudicial killings could still continue, although perhaps I speculate it would not be as rampant, considering that the Marcoses don't, unlike Duterte's record in Davao, the Marcoses didn't have such high incidences of extrajudicial killings in Ilocos while he was a governor. Red tagging could still remain as a possible concern in light of, as part and parcel of the general disinformation campaign. And finally, how do we see Marcos differing in his policy on the enforcement of arbitral ruling of the West Philippine Sea case against China? And some other new concerns are issues on historical legal revisionism and disinformation, including undermining already enacted laws and decided cases against the Marcoses, as well as pending corruption cases, both against the Marcoses and their cronies, as well as under the Duterte administration. And we have to question whether the perceived loyalties that we found under the Duterte administration extend across administrations. As mentioned, 13 out of the 15 members of the Supreme Court are now appointed by Duterte, with 2 remaining justices appointed by Aquino. Marcos will not have a chance to appoint a new justice until 2025. And barring unforeseen circumstances, Marcos will only be appointing 1 chief justice and 3 associate justices during his entire term. However, as an ally of Duterte, Will Marcos also enjoy a friendly court? That's something that we should we can discuss later. And because some of the cases to watch out for include the now pending case on Marcos's disqualification in the recent elections, which of course he won. There is also the review of his mother, Imelda Marcos's conviction for graft, as well as other graft and corruption and ill-gotten wealth cases against the Marcoses and their cronies, still pending in many courts, including the graft court and also the Supreme Court. And finally, there could be a possible case if the ICC decides to investigate violations of human rights under Duterte, who is Marcos's ally, of course. Moving to other appointments beyond the Supreme Court, there are appointments to other oversight institutions, including the constitutional commissions, which includes the Commission on Elections, the Commission on Audit, and the Commission on Civil Service. These positions usually outlast presidents with their terms of 7 years to ensure the independence of the institution. And it's usually unlikely that a single sitting president will be able to appoint all of its members because the terms are staggered. And again, they're 7 years. However, Duterte's recent appointments of the Commission on Elections chair and 2 other members of the Commission on Elections, as well as Duterte's appointment of the chair of the Civil Service Commission and the chair of the Commission on Audit. These late appointments were not confirmed by Congress before the close of session. This means that Duterte's appointments have effectively been bypassed and now allows Marcos to appoint these officials when he assumes the presidency. This, along with the end of term of the other members who are now sitting, would mean that Marcos would have the unprecedented opportunity to appoint all of the members of all of the constitutional bodies during his term. That would be 7 COMELEC officials, 3 Commission on Audit officials, and 3 commissioners of the Civil Service Commission. Meanwhile, Marcos will also be appointing all 5 commissioners of the Commission on Human Rights, which had been a pivotal body under Duterte because it was one of the few commissions that went against Duterte. And finally, Marcos will also be appointing all 5 commissioners of the Presidential Commission on Good Government. Well, this is nothing new because technically the PCGG is an executive agency. We have to consider the irony of a President Marcos appointing commissioners to the primary agency tasked with investigating and recovering the Marcos ill-gotten wealth. And so in conclusion, Bongbong Marcos might not have the chance to appoint as many Supreme Court justices as Duterte or GMA before him, but there are questions of whether this will still be a friendly Supreme Court. And another is that he can still have significant influence in shaping Philippine legal institutions and other oversight agencies. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks so much. And apologies for sharing the wrong slide view with all of you.
It's okay, Bjorn. I didn't want to cut you off while you were already presenting. We could read the presentation anyway. So thank you very much to our distinguished speakers for their very interesting talk. At this point, I'd like to open the Q&A for our audience. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and personally ask the question. Please also let us know to whom your question is directed. I'm sure you have lots of questions after those very interesting questions. Those very interesting presentations. I think Paul here, who is sitting beside me, may have a question.
Thank you very. Let's try again and make sure we don't have any audio problems. Good. Thank you very much to all presenters for very interesting and insightful presentations, helping us to understand what perhaps some of the legacies of the former administration may be moving forward. I have a question for each of the presentations. Starting first with Cleve, you seem to conclude, if I'm not mistaken, by saying New Society 2.0 may also be the Duterte administration 2.0. And I'm wondering why you would necessarily expect that level of continuity. First of all, would you expect Bongbong Marcos to continue to be categorized as a populist, or does he have a different type of rule that we might anticipate? And I would say, of course, that given that he ran a campaign that was devoid of policy, we all have a difficulty understanding what might be coming next, but I might ask you to speculate on that. And then in terms of the patterns of popular mobilization and the relative absence of popular mobilization under Duterte, whether from the administration itself, as you noted, Jun Nabasco's ideas didn't get very far, or from the opposition, where things never quite got off the ground. Why would you necessarily expect that the Pink Army will fade away? Maybe it will, but does it not potentially have some opportunity, likelihood of resurrecting itself in certain sorts of circumstances? And especially given that the Marcos administration has some very important economic headwinds that it's facing, the inflationary pressures that are there that could really present potentially some problems to its popularity. Second question is for Ross, and you did some historical parallels back to the late 1980s. I'd like to ask whether you see any historical parallels potentially back to the early 1970s, because of course Ferdinand Marcos Sr. coming in with martial law rule had a lot of policies that were, say the least, very repressive against the military or against the press, shutting down many key outlets. As you speculate on the new media environment that we have, and if we were to suppose that it's in the interest of the Marcos administration to try to tamp down criticism in the media, does he need to do anything similar to what his father did if he wants to reduce opposition, or are all of these new techniques so effective that he doesn't need to consider that level of overt oppression through all of the mechanisms that you highlighted, the way in which disinformation campaigns can be so useful and the traditional media is marginalized without lifting a finger? And then a question for Bjorn and Christina. Thank you very much for that overview of these important issues in the Supreme Court, and also how you concluded with these important potential issues in other constitutional bodies, not analysis that I'd seen before. Wondering, knowing in analysis of Philippine politics, how it's important so often to go from the formal to the informal, what role, if any, might we anticipate from the incoming First Lady, who is herself a lawyer and has very deep personal connections with the legal community? What impact, if any, might that have? So those are my questions, and thanks again to everybody for terrific presentations.
Joy, should I answer the question, or are we collecting
No, I think you can
questions?
answer the question. We'll call on the next question after you've answered them. So, Cleve?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Paul, for your questions. I'll start with your first question addressed to me. Why am I saying that New Society 2.0 may also be like the 30s 2.0? I'm only saying this in the context of the elements of political mobilization, which is my task in this discussion, to really focus on the elements of political mobilization. I think we are seeing similarities in terms of the coalition, the socio-economic coalitions that Duterte and now Marcos Jr. has been able to put together. So they were able to attract a cross-class coalition of the poor, but also you have a strong level of support coming from the middle and the upper classes there. I also want to emphasize that I think so far what we have been seeing, how they've run the campaign, for example, and what we know about the Duterte administration, that this is likely to be a mixture of really demobilizing the people, in the sense that the government is here to take care of, whatever issues you are after, and whatever kinds of services you want, but we're not really going to mobilize you guys to be, active citizens, and to have that dynamic participatory energy. That's not the expectation. I think, especially if you look at how they ran the campaign. So at least in terms of that it will have elements of being demobilizing, but at the same time having the popular support of this cross-class coalition. In that it's in that context that I see some similarities. But you're definitely right that we have yet to see many aspects of the second Marcos administration develop, because we're still in the dark in terms of its really policy priorities. It has yet to complete its cabinet members, although the key appointments have already been made, but we're still watching. Second question, is Bongbong Marcos also a populist? I wouldn't say so. I've begun to look at his campaign speeches and try to analyze it using the standard way of analyzing presidential speeches coming from a populist perspective, from a populist lens. And he doesn't really rate well in terms of the amount of populism in his discourse. So I think it's really more about this classic nationalist authoritarian leader that we see in Bongbong Marcos. And as we have seen also, especially in the press conferences after the elections, he's styling himself to be a statesman, sort of like respectable. And this is probably one of the very few things that we will be liking from this administration, that finally we don't have an interpreter, right, to understand presidential speeches. And lastly, on the Pink Army, I think the Pink Army, the Pink movement, suffers, at least from my initial observation, suffers from the weakness of being like many other of the civil society-led mobilizations in the Philippines, in the sense that it's a temporary alliance, it's decentralized, it's a convenient alliance among different sectors that were interested during this particular period. And there are no indications that we will see it institutionalized or be routinized into something more like a formal political party or a more formal political organization. The Vice President, Lenny Robredo, is starting an NGO around this pink movement. And this path is definitely a double-edged sword when it comes to building an active political opposition. It may or may not contribute towards that goal. As we know, it may take the direction of just really NGOism and development and humanitarian related work, but it could also be shifted towards the direction of building an active political opposition. But right now, we haven't really heard from those involved whether the priority is the development aspect or the opposition aspect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cleve. Ross?
Yeah, quickly, so we have time for questions. I guess just in light of the recent order for telcos to block websites deemed communist, this use of the anti-terror law of 2020 shows that there is still much there is still much to come in the way that the new administration might look to handle the media. And it was described in the papers today by one person as this sort of as mad as the Marcos anti-democracy internet firewall. So we'll be watching that fairly closely, as to whether we're going to see the more blocking of websites, the use of the anti-terror law, red tagging potentially, and that's obviously very concerning when we think. And some of these websites, by the way, were US websites like Counterpunch and the Monthly Review deemed socialist websites. So we're not just looking at Facebook pages of the Communist Party affiliated pages or something like that. So yeah, it will be interesting to see whether that progresses. Christina or Bjorn?
Christina, maybe you go first.
Yeah. Yes. So on the question on the role of the First Lady in the legal community, I don't think she would have such a large formal influence on the rule of law. She has not really been active in law practice, and since Bongbong has been in politics, although she used to be aligned with known allies of GMA, of the Arroyo administration. She was a partner of a law firm allied with GMA. However, we know that, so in the formal sense, I don't think she would be that active. However, we know that the Philippine legal community is very much embedded in personal networks. So she might have some opinions on appointments, for example, of friends and former colleagues in key positions. I'm not sure. Of course, in a recent pre-election interview, she says that she is definitely not interested in an official government post, and she's just not interested. She's too New York for that, she says.
Thank you very much, Christina, for the response, and Ross also. Now we have 3 questions on queue. I think we only have enough time for 3. So we'll call on Joshua Ho first, and then David Kamru, and then I'll read the 3rd question from Epi sent through the chat box. Joshua?
Thank you very much. I think I have 3 questions to Dr. Arguelles. When does the Marcos Duterte Leviathan have any basis in the previous Ferdinand Marcos regime, like in regards to his philosophy? And to Dr. Dressel, given the peculiar proportion of Duterte's assignments, is he manipulating the law and the legal system to suit his agendas? And to Dr. Ross Stepsell, given that there's a current war between dictators and Democrats, in this case, who do you think will win in the long run? And the other question is, in this war between dictators and Democrats on social media, is there any moral order in terms of who gets the upper hand?
Okay, please take note of the questions, dear speakers. Let's have the question of David so that we can have the answers in one round. Yes, David.
Hello. Good morning from Paris. This is an after breakfast question. So given that Marcos Sr. was one of the founders of ASEAN, and given that Bongbong wants to rehabilitate the legacy of his father, can you provide some speculation as to what role Bongbong will try and play within ASEAN, for example, on the question of Myanmar? I'm not sure who to address the question to, so I'm throwing it out to you all.
All right, thank you so much. Here's the 3rd question from Epi. Will media literacy initiatives potentially spearheaded by the Pink Movement, similar to these implemented in Finland, be effective in countering disinformation in the Philippines? So I think this question is directed to Ross. Okay, so those are the 3 questions. Maybe we can start with Cleve, then we can call on Bjorn and Christina, and then we can have Ross. Would that be fine? Okay, Cleve.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your question, Joshua, but thank you for awarding me my PhD, but I'm not yet a doctor. So is there a basis, is there a similar kind of like philosophy of the Leviathan in the Marcos Sr. administration? I think I think that if you look at how Marcos Sr. tried to assemble his coalition, there was an attempt to really build that centralized state, but centered on the Marcos, a sort of like a more personalistic kind of like leadership. But they were also unable to, at least especially towards the end of the dictatorship, they were no longer able to buy the support of the other types of elites in the country that at least according to the framework of that dictator that inspired me to assign this to use this metaphor of the Leviathan, that these other elites, for example, the communal elite, the church, for example, should be instrumental in building the Leviathan. So I think you see some convergences, but you also see some divergences in that case. Just a very brief response to David's question. I think in terms of foreign policy, right now we just know that he will continue the Duterte position on the West Philippine Sea issue. He's spoken about that. We have yet to see an appointment to the Department of Foreign Affairs that will really definitely signal to us whether he wants to take a bigger role in the ASEAN. But you're also right that ASEAN, the Philippine participation in ASEAN and the founding of the ASEAN is one of the associated legacies to the first Marcos administration. So but the way that the ASEAN looks right now, and that it's shaping up to be sort of like a club of, as we all know, authoritarian leaders, then I could say that Marcos Jr. will feel at home in that regional organization. Yeah, thank you.
Right. I mean, I have to confess, I'm not entirely clear what Joshua was asking in terms of legal manipulations. Now, let me try to wrap up a few points in response to the previous questions. I mean, I think the argument that Christina and I have made a couple of years ago is that in a highly legalistic society like the Philippines, a lot of the authoritarian tendencies are still couched in a formal language. So you proceed via impeachment proceedings, you try to manipulate the legal rules, you essentially pursue a route through the formal system rather than outright abandoning any veneer of a legal system. Having said this, precisely for that notion, the Supreme Court becomes occasionally an important veto player. So when questions are raised about constitutional change, often questions like these will end up ultimately with the Supreme Court. And so the influence over the Supreme Court bench is an important one. Now, that's where informal influences come in. And I think Paul is absolutely right to point out that some of these influences are not just formal. They are often done through channels that we don't fully understand, but we get often an idea that they work behind alumni associations, fraternities, personal telephone calls, and so on and so forth, although judges would never admit to it. Now, I will say something, though, that contradicts everything I've just said before, because it's an ongoing discussion between me and Christina, and I invite everyone here to reflect on this as well. In some ways, though, and I disagree with Cleveland and Slater's argument about the Leviathan and the elites striking back and wanting to manipulate some of these institutions. In some ways, I wonder sometimes to what degree a slow judicial system like in the Philippines is really a threat to some of the elite interests. In other words, court cases take forever. Some of the outcomes can be bought if needed. In other words, the court is an important player, but it's probably not the most important player, particularly also if you have large majorities in parliament that you can manipulate, you can get around certain constraints if needed. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, yes, most of the cases of authoritarian backsliding have a legal component to it. The Philippines, it's particularly pronounced and it's important to notice. But I think the role of the court is still something that we need to watch closely, and it's an open question. Will it stand up as an independent arbiter? Will it be succumb to an authoritarian regime as we have seen it in the past? Or will there actually be some strategic activities on the side of the Chief Justice and his group of justices in navigating that field between the popularity and the institutional reputation of the court and a political environment that is ever shifting?
If I can add to that, to what Bjorn said, talking about the manipulation of the legal system by Duterte. And I think that he had a sort of a two-pronged approach. One would be attacking legal institutions outright, and we can see this through filing of impeachments. For example, in his first 2 years in office, he had already filed his allies had already filed 4 impeachment cases against the vice president, the then ombudsman, the chair of the Commission on Elections, and so the filing of impeachment cases, and also through the budgetary system, through the budget system. For example, the Commission on Human Rights was given only a budget of 1,000 pesos. That's like $20 1 year, right? So there's the direct attack, and then there's also in undermining these institutions, but then there's also the co-optation of institutions. And this is perhaps what Bjorn and I have been discussing more, especially with the Supreme Court and other appointments, because there, of course, a president can appoint, but how much influence will this president have in their appointments or in the decision making of these bodies because of the people they appoint? Okay.
Thank you very much, Ross, for the question from Epi.
Yeah, thanks. So 2 questions. The first question on media literacy. I mean, it's always the easiest answer to give, right? Like we should have more media literacy. The problem, of course, is that to be done on a large scale, they tend to need to be government sponsored. And it's generally not in the interests of governments to grow a critical public sphere. So that's the first problem. And then when they do create large-scale government media literacy programs, they tend to be politicized, or at least pushed in certain directions to support the ruling administration. And the classic case of this would be Singapore, where you have really high levels of literacy, where people read the Straits Times in schools, every day, but there's not a flourishing democratic space for criticism and commenting of the administration. So media literacy programs are not it'd be great if we could just say, yeah, let's all just run really good media literacy programs. But unfortunately, there's no easy solution to these problems. And I add to that fact checkers, as good and as hardworking as some of these fact checkers are, they're not the sole solution to a problem, and they're generally underfunded and not really making major changes in the way that disinformation operates. Finally, the question, well, who's winning? I mean, this is a very difficult question in 30 seconds or so, but I guess in a nutshell, yeah, I mean, come on, disinformation's winning, right? Like look at the storming of the US Capitol, look at the elections around the world. And overall, you'd have to say that social media has been manipulated in ways which have now moved it away from that original space as this, as this sort of flourishing through the Arab Spring, through the Bersay movement, through the perhaps some of the other exciting reformist and liberationary type messages that it was sending. Now, this is not unique. Television was initially a great conduit for Vietnam War activism. The internet, when it was first came through abroad, was used by democratic activists in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So ultimately, I think it's time that we gave up on the current social media platforms and the Silicon Valley driven organizations run by Zuckerberg and Musk and so on. And it's time we need new digital media spaces to be created. And until that time, I can't see us getting out of this current conundrum that we're in.
Okay, before we end today's session, I think Paul has one more.
No. If anyone.
Is there anyone who would like to ask any more question? Oh, David has, I think, a follow-up question before we formally end today's session. Oh, no.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So, Alejandra, can you please read to us the question that you have? Thank you.
The presentations a while ago stated that Duterte and Marcos' electoral victory was influenced mainly by disinformation campaigns and rewriting of history. Are there indicators that say otherwise?
Thank you. Yes, I think I have a response to that question. So I think what the question is about is this allegation, and still quite popular among young people, especially online as well. And I think this is turning to be a problem as well, sort of like something developing as a disinformative narrative as well around that there were massive irregularities and massive cheating in the elections, and that this probably explains the result of the elections. That instead of disinformation, and that instead of all of the things that's been pointed out so far as factors driving the outcomes, that it's totally explained by this cheating. So I think what we have seen so far, and there were independent audits, and it's still ongoing for some civil society organizations, but the main ones, NAMFLEL, Lente, and even the election observation of the ANFREL, the Asian Network for Free Elections, for example, they haven't really seen any systematic cheating, systematic irregularity in the election. With that said, definitely, as in the past, and as is very usual in Philippine elections, there are still cases of election fraud and irregularity, especially at the local level. Many of it, for example, in south part of the Philippines or in other parts of the Philippines where there is total monopoly of control and power for the incumbent dynasty. So I think these two truths could coexist together. That just like any other past election, that there were some irregularities, but I don't think that this is that the entire outcome, that this entire shift in Philippine politics can alone be explained by election fraud. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to respond to the question, Ross or Bjorn and Christina? No? Okay, so I guess that ends today's session. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for this topical discussion. It has definitely been a very interesting day.